Hi, I'm Phil Sapirstein, a professor of architectural history and archaeology at U of T. I'd like to introduce a new series of talks, which we will be releasing over the coming weeks about methods in art history, which is going to be based on the interests and expertise of our faculty and graduate students. We'll have a series of short overviews of topics relating to the study of art, architecture, and museums, which should give you a sense of the tremendous variety and breadth of approaches employed by art historians today. I'd like to kick off this series by talking about an important new development that's part of my own research, but which is also transforming the way in which many other art historians and museum professionals study and share their material: 3D modeling. My primary focus will be a new technique known as photogrammetry that promises to do nothing less than revolutionize the way we study art and architecture. Since I'm an archaeologist and an architectural historian, I'll focus on how photogrammetry has been applied to ancient material, but it is by no means limited to a particular period or a particular area in art history. I'll be moving pretty quickly through my images just to give you advance notice. And I have some links to outside resources throughout the presentation. Rather than pausing the video, if you want to follow up on any of those links, you can find these more conveniently reposted on the webpage with this video. To begin, there have been many advances in ways to share collections with students, researchers, and the general public beyond the walls of the museum. The Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., for example, made a pioneering website providing virtual tours based on 3D scans of their collections. Many others have followed suit, and these efforts have accelerated in the past year as museums, temporarily closed by the pandemic, have sought to expand their digitization efforts. This slide lists just a few examples, and it includes some of the more popular platforms like Sketchfabs, where individuals can upload their own collections of 3D models through a user-friendly web interface. The Thingiverse is another platform hosting models for 3D printing, and if you have access to a printer of your own, you can make copies of objects like these shared by the Metropolitan Museum in New York. One reason for the proliferation of 3D content on the web is the improvement in tools for creating 3D models of the world around us. A little over a decade ago, I made this slide overviewing the different approaches to creating 3D models, each of which had drawbacks. Tools for manually digitizing an object are agonizingly slow or require cumbersome equipment, while laser scanning was the gold standard for producing 3D content about 10 years ago. However, laser scanners are fairly expensive and not always that easy to use, and so back then, 3D recording was a fairly specialized niche. That's all changing with the arrival of a powerful new technique called photogrammetry, a type of computer software that's capable of producing very accurate and lifelike models of just about anything from a series of photographs. Although the concept is older, photogrammetry has only been available for the last decade as a practical, low-cost alternative for generating 3D models. I'll say a few words about how photogrammetry works using my architectural study of the early Greek temple at Olympia dedicated to the goddess Hera as an example. This was the first place where I tried out photogrammetry at a large scale, creating 3D models that superseded the published drawings of the site in detail and accuracy. The idea of measuring from still photographs goes back to the first era of photography, beginning with the expectation that one could measure cities and landscapes by comparing aerial photographs. During the 20th century, various complicated mechanical devices were invented that could extract 3D points from airplane photos, although this was limited to specialized government-sponsored projects. Photogrammetry became more accessible in the computer era, and by the 1990s, software was introduced that could extract 3D measurements from any set of photographs taken from different points of view. Although the computer could solve the complex equations to work out coordinates on the images, this was a painstakingly slow process, since a person had to mark every point manually. Even after hours of matching points, you'd end up with no more than a skeletal representation of the subject, just the points and lines that you marked yourself. This changed dramatically in the 2000s with the arrival of pattern recognition techniques. A computer nowadays can identify distinctive features in an image and then match them to similar features in another photograph, effectively automating all the work that we once had to do by hand. Modern photogrammetry software does most of the work on its own, and so it's much faster and easier to learn. At Olympia, I had to take all the pictures of the Hira temple myself. Here's a picture of me above, struggling with a pole in order to get the camera high enough to see this tall building. But the software processing is largely automatic. For example, here is a pair of photographs on the same part of the building, and below are the same images with the dots in gray and blue showing the thousands of matches that the photogrammetry software discovered on its own after a few minutes of processing. I won't go into the technical details, but the machine determines where all the cameras were originally located and builds a 3D preview of the subject and the first processing step. Then it goes back and searches for more matches, building what can be an incredibly detailed model after additional processing, which might take a few minutes or hours, depending on the settings and the number of source images. What we're seeing here are not photographs, but rather the 3D models for part of the Hira temple. Olympia was a big job requiring several weeks of work, but in the end I had an extraordinarily detailed lifelike representation of the whole temple site. I've used this resource extensively to support my studies of Olympia, especially when I was back on campus and couldn't easily visit the site. And this was also a great way to illustrate publications about the temple. Photogrammetry is not just for architecture, it works with most subjects that can be photographed. In the museum, you can create models of artifacts. The method you see here uses artificial lighting and places the object on a turntable in order to shoot all the different views quickly. Here are views of the models that resulted, which are hard to distinguish from actual photographs. But these are full-blown 3D representations that are also accurately scaled to the sizes of the original objects. These are small pieces, just a few centimeters across, but the 3D scans capture details down to fractions of a millimeter. As photogrammetry has made 3D data more commonplace in art and archaeological studies, it's having more and more impact on how we study and share our research with others. For one, the 3D models are a great basis for 2D illustrations. You can show the original 3D scan and perhaps add annotations like outlines to draw attention to key features or to show different measurements of a subject. The 3D renderings don't have to resemble a handmade line drawing either. Here are a couple of examples of non-photographic techniques that are generated by the computer and draw attention to different kinds of features that are hard to make out in a traditional photograph. One application is enhancing engravings, like the prehistoric rock-cut art on the left, which is almost invisible in the photo, but pops out after special rendering modes are applied to the scan. One of the coolest archaeological projects I was lucky enough to be a part of was modeling a cache of objects from Crete that you see here. Again, the artificial rendering modes do an excellent job of bringing out relief ornament on these miniature, intricately engraved objects. Yet another application of 3D scans is the virtual reassembly of broken fragments, which can benefit from other computer techniques that help find matching surfaces among a collection of scanned pieces. And this brings me back to the virtual 3D museums, which are sharing parts of a physical museum with a much bigger audience online, the world at large. As 3D printers become more inexpensive and widespread, we have new possibilities to print replicas from these collections. This not only opens up new educational opportunities, but it allows researchers to compare objects in different parts of the world. For example, objects which have been separated among multiple collections can be reunited virtually through 3D scans on the screen and physically through reassembled 3D printed replicas. In closing, I'd like to emphasize that photogrammetry is much more accessible than previous methods for creating 3D scans. If you'd like to get some hands-on experience, you can start making models right now with no more than a smartphone camera, using one of the tools mentioned on this slide. After some practice, you might want to try out some of the professional software, which is not terribly difficult to learn on your own, but I also teach photogrammetry in some of my classes. I hope you've enjoyed my brief overview of photogrammetry and its tremendous potential. It is so new that I can only imagine what other uses art historians and museum curators will find for it in the coming decades. It's a great technology to learn now, since it will become increasingly important in research and education about art and museums in the future, and it is already an attractive skill for employment in museums and universities. If you'd like to learn more about photogrammetry, feel free to get in touch with me, and thanks for watching.